So delighted to be joined by one of the foremost voices across the realm of combat sports journalism, Ariel Helwani, whose work you can find on the Uncrowned platform by way of Yahoo Sports. Ariel, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. What's the crack?
All good. You've got the lingo down. I know you're a
Yeah,
frequenter of this part of the world.
I do enjoy it. My good friend Pete Carroll has a show on the Uncrowned platform called The Crack. He is the pride of Blanchardstown, so I've
Mm-hmm.
learned a lot about Edda, Dublin, Blanchardstown, and everything in between. So I'm a great admirer.
Yeah, Paul, our sound engineer outside, was telling me he worked on a video you did over here with Pizzi where you were tasting
Ah,
potato
yes.
crisp sandwiches.
And the chicken fillet,
Oh,
as you
yeah.
guys call it, which I think is a crazy way to pronounce chicken fillet. You don't do the hard T, but yes, oh, he was there. That was right before the Katie Taylor Chantel Cameron first fight at the Three Arena, which coincidentally is my last time in Dublin. That was a great time. My experiences there, I've only been twice, but both of them. The first one was for Conor McGregor's UFC Dublin debut, if you will, July of 2014, and then almost 10 years later when Chantel and Katie had their incredible fight. So great memories.
And just on McGregor, we might come back to that later and his political endeavours or potential ones. But I mentioned at the top, you're one of the few, probably with the distinction across the combat sports gamut, covering the three: boxing, MMA, and WWE, the towers and pillars of this TKO endeavour. Having covered them all separately, Ariel, are you surprised at all that they've suddenly the worlds have collided and they've meshed together in this endeavour, as I call it?
Yeah, and that's a great pun, by the way, because they are owned by Endeavor. So there was once a time, I grew up a pro wrestling fan, right? So that was like my first introduction into the world of combat sports when I'm 5 years old. And then from then, I was born in '82. So like from then, you're introduced to boxing and you're introduced to Mike Tyson and the video game and all that stuff. And then in the mid '90s, you're introduced to the UFC and mixed martial arts. It wasn't originally known as mixed martial arts. It was just ultimate fighting and then no holds barred fighting and then MMA. You kind of wonder like, oh wow, this is a mix of everything. This has a little pro wrestling to it, some showmanship, some pizzazz, and it also has the realness of boxing. This is great. And so when I start to cover MMA specifically for a living, I was one of the guys who was like, this is a lot like WWE. I hate to break it to you guys, but this is kind of a carbon copy of WWE, except for the fact that it's not scripted. Dana is Vince, the storylines, even like the cage, all that stuff feels very pro wrestling. And some of the purists, if you will, would get very upset about this. Don't you dare! And I would always say that there's a Venn diagram, and in the middle, the likes of me would be. There would be MMA, there would be wrestling, there would be boxing, and in the middle, people like me would be there who kind of appreciate and understand and love it all, and don't feel like you have to pick one or the other. If you would have told some of these fans back in 2013-14 that first off WWE and UFC would join forces, their heads would have exploded. But once it happened a couple of years ago and they formed TKO, I always knew that the third pillar would be boxing for multiple reasons. They called it TKO. Obviously, when you think of TKO, you think of boxing first and then MMA. The people involved, namely Nick Khan, who I've known for several years. He was once my agent. And I knew that he was a huge boxing fan. He kind of entered the world of representation. He was long a sports agent, most notably with CAA, Creative Artists Agency. He entered the world of representation working with the likes of Freddie Roach and Manny Pacquiao. He's from Las Vegas, and I knew boxing was near and dear to his heart. So when I would joke about it with him, I would say, like, when's the boxing announcement coming? And so it just kind of always felt like a natural next step for them. Once they got WWE, they got UFC, that there'd be one other pillar occupied by boxing. And so here we are, September 13th, it officially launches.
It's funny you mentioned WWE as your gateway in, because I was kind of probably similar as a child watching Stone Cold and The Rock and these kinds of people. And then Prince Nassim Hamid came along in this part of the world, and I kind of couldn't delineate between the two. I just figured, oh, it's all between the ropes. It's probably all the same. So however you get there, people get there in different ways. But There had been a fusion of these sports in the past, like going back decades, needless to say. But it was probably the Mayweather McGregor thing that crystallized in people's heads that these crossovers are achievable, but more so can actually garner mainstream attention.
Yeah, I mean, even dating back to the 70s, Muhammad Ali fought Antonio Inoki, who was a legendary Japanese pro wrestler. I think Mayweather McGregor birthed the influencer crossover boxing scene, the Misfits of the world, the Jake Pauls of the world, the Logan Pauls of the world, the KSIs. It all starts in 2016, really. 2016, the UFC is bought by Endeavor, led by Ari Emanuel, who's a very, very powerful agent. If you're a fan of the TV show Entourage, the agent in that television series, Ari Gold, is basically played off of him. And they buy it in 2016 from the Fertitta brothers, from Dana White, for $4.025 billion. And at the time, I'll be the first to say, I was like, man, I think these guys overpaid. Like $4 billion is a lot of money. Sports franchises aren't going for that much. Like, this seems like a lot. Now, I think it was a steal. And that's 2016. So 17, 18, they get the ESPN deal here in America. The sport starts to grow, especially in the pandemic. And obviously, all this stuff happens with Vince McMahon, and then he decides to sell, and they swoop in. There were reports that the Saudis were going to buy it, that other entities were going to buy it, Fox was going to buy it, all this stuff, WWE I'm talking about. And once they got it, it made all the sense in the world. They could own combat sports. TKO is, they own MMA, they own pro wrestling. And I know that there are other leagues, don't get me wrong, but they own the top dogs in each. Obviously, now they're starting pretty low with boxing, but look at their first show. It's on Netflix. It's Canelo Crawford. So they have pinpointed the fact that there's an opening here. It's not like you can't own basketball here in America. There's the NBA and there's 30 owners. You can't own the NFL. You can't own the Premier League. You can own these sports. And they've done a brilliant job of conquering MMA and conquering pro wrestling now, and they're going to do the same. And I think they're going to be successful. And oh, by the way, I mentioned Nick. I mean, Dana White's first love was boxing, and he's the front man for this particular fight. And so he had been talking about getting into the world of boxing dating back to Mayweather McGregor. He was wearing the Zuffa boxing shirts then. And for whatever reason, he doesn't figure it out. He feels like it's too difficult. But the guy, obviously, that changes it all is Turki Al-Sheikh of Saudi Arabia, who is a gigantic wrestling and boxing fan and has an appreciation for MMA. And once he gets into the mix, almost 2 years ago, October of 2023, with the Tyson Fury Francis Ngannou fight, these very powerful and these very savvy men come together and say, like, we could conquer all of this, and that's what's happening.
And to focus on Dana White just for a second, as you said, he's going to be a totem and a notable aspect of that huge fight on Netflix next weekend. Compared to his previous quote unquote like pump fakes or like threatening to get into boxing, not really doing it, like this one does feel very different. This one feels sincere and viable.
100%. You know why? Because he's not doing it on his own. Before, it was essentially on him to figure it out. Yeah, he had a partner in Lorenzo Fertitta. He had Frank Fertitta. These were the previous owners of the UFC who sold and left the company when they sold it to Endeavor in 2016. Dana remained. He was a part of the deal. He's still the front man, the president, the CEO of the UFC. But now he's got some of the most powerful businessmen in America and the most powerful sports minds in America. He's got Nick Khan by his side. He's got Ari Emanuel by his side. He's got Mark Shapiro, formerly of ESPN, the COO and president of TKO, by his side. And he's got Turkey by his side. It's not on him. I mean, in many respects, I'm not suggesting this is what's happening. All he has to do is show up. He's got the WWE production and UFC production backing him. Like, just show up, do the thing. And you see, like, he's doing some promotion for this. He was at the press conferences and whatnot. But, this is much bigger than just Dana. I mean, just witness the fact that the fight is happening at Allegiant Stadium. Dana has always said he doesn't like stadium shows. You can ask your friends in Ireland. He was asked many times about Croke Park. He doesn't like to do stadium shows. The first show is a stadium show. So what that suggests to me is that he's not the only one making the calls here. This is going to be like almost like a WrestleMania Super Bowl like spectacle, in my opinion. And the fact that it's taking place on the biggest streaming platform in the world is gigantic, and they want to be in business with Netflix in addition to their other partners as well. So it feels very different than all the other times that Dana was talking about it, because now he's got real muscle behind them.
Yeah, and that muscle, the cohorts you mentioned there, and we might return to the Saudi element. I know the political aspect in the United States isn't quite on that level in terms of day to day, but on Congress terms, the Muhammad Ali American Boxing Revival Act is obviously notable in this context, and the bipartisan support which was proffered, and Dana's affiliation with Donald Trump was very visible on the night he was elected. So it might just be worth, if you don't mind, reiterating what the Ali Act does in its current form and what TKO might be looking to achieve by adjusting the parameters around it or related to it.
So the Ali Act was something that was introduced about 25 years ago, and it was introduced by the likes of John McCain, Senator John McCain, who is no longer with us, to try to protect boxers from many different things, and to try to make it an even a level playing field, meaning that there would be independent rankings, that one organization couldn't just dominate the sport and have its own belt, and you could only fight for that belt if you fight for them. No, there's going to be independent rankings and independent sanctioning bodies, and if you're the top guy, you're going to have an opportunity to fight for that belt. There were other things involved as well about making public, the pay, purses, and things like that. Managers not being able to be promoters, so not being able to double dip.
Yeah.
All these things, by the way, either happen or don't happen in MMA. And what I mean by that is managers can double dip in MMA. There isn't an independent ranking committee or any sort of resource out there. The purses don't have to be made public, things of that nature. There is no Ali Act in MMA. So there is nothing stopping a UFC from creating its own belt and saying, this is the number one promotion, and this is the number one belt, and we are not going to play with others, and unless you sign with us, you're not going to get a chance to fight for it. Obviously, boxing is much different. There's WBC and WBO and WBA and IBF and all this stuff, different independent sanctioning bodies. And so they are trying to alter it. Now, their position is, this is going to be better for the fighters. We're trying to do this to protect the fighters. We're trying to do this to help the fighters, to give them more opportunities. Obviously the devil's in the details, and they've got a very powerful ally in the White House right now. And so I think whatever they are going to try to do with the Ali Act, as far as amending it and whatnot, I think they'll be successful because of Donald Trump and because of their allies in Washington. If there's another guy in there, then it's a much tougher thing. But we've seen several instances in which their relationship, Dana and Trump and the other players involved, has benefited them. There was a guy named Khamzat Chimaev who just fought for the UFC middleweight title in August in Chicago, and for the past couple of years, it was largely and widely reported that he couldn't enter the country for various reasons, had visa issues. All of a sudden, Donald Trump is in office, and he himself, Khamzat, said himself that it was essentially Donald Trump that got him to be able to come to the United States. Darren Till, a Liverpool fighter, used to fight for the UFC, had issues coming into the United States when Trump was in office the first time, and he was able to make things happen again. That's not normal. They're having a fight at the White House next July. So these aren't normal times, and so they're able to benefit due to their relationship with him.
And just on the Revival Act, I know Andy Foster was on your show, and he's executive officer of the California State Athletic Commission. So he's an influential regulator in that part of the world. And he's kind of the opinion that like a well-financed company coming in with some muscle isn't a bad thing from a bottom-up perspective. But then I think the prevailing sense is that TKO at large aren't doing this for the goodness of their health. Like the ultimate win is probably for them rather than the fighters. I don't know where you fall down on that, or maybe it's too early to say.
I mean, ultimately, gun to my head, yeah, it's so that they can have their own belts and their own rankings and essentially copy the model that has been so successful for them in the UFC. I mean, Dana White himself has said it. Like, we're not looking to have WBC title fights here. Now, in the early days, they might have to, but they want to copy the WWE and UFC model. I've always said UFC and WWE are a lot more similar to UFC and Matchroom. Matchroom has to play with others. Matchroom has to make fights. Eddie Hearn has to promote with other people in order to make the biggest and best fights for his fighters. UFC doesn't. WWE doesn't. And so they want to recreate those models. That's why they're perfect. They're perfect. They're a perfect pair. And so it is for their own benefit. Now they'll tell you, look at the success of the UFC. It works. Boxing is obviously like 100 years older. But it's still very unclear, honestly, because the day they came out with the announcement in March, they said, like, we're not going to deal with these 3-letter belts and we're not going to deal with the other promoters, all this stuff. And a lot of pundits, purists, came out and said, oh, but the WBC title, that means something. These old titles mean something. And then Turki Al-Sheikh himself said, we're not getting rid of those belts. And so I don't know. I don't know what to believe. I guess we just have to see how it all plays out. But yes, to answer the question very bluntly, they're doing this for their own benefit. And of course, they're going to tell the world that it will also benefit the fighters. That remains to be seen.
And boxing, it wouldn't be in this position. It wouldn't be susceptible for a hostile takeover or a takeover of any kind wholesale in the way that we're potentially talking about. But like in the last 20 years, I suppose it's been vying and teetering and rolling with the punches to keep the mainstream visibility it had. Like 50 years ago, it was the biggest sport in America at one time. And then you've seen like those classic fights we would have watched on like HBO and Showtime in the States. And then over here, like Sky Sports and TNT have like taken their foot off the pedal on boxing for the moment. And then DAZN have been like fighting a lonely fight in some respect, like really putting on quality shows. And then, but other streamers like Triller have tried and failed. So the short story is boxing, it's like they might come in and shape boxing to their image, but boxing probably needs some sort of revitalization in monetary terms or in terms of vibrancy.
Yeah, and the man who recognized that was Turki Al-Sheikh. His exact title, he's part of the General Entertainment Authority, GIA, under the Saudi umbrella, and a very, very powerful and influential guy, big combat sports fan. And I think what he and his team have recognized, the Joe sports fan who happens to be a football fan, meaning soccer here in this country, football in your country, or a golf fan, would view them as maybe like disruptors, nuisances. Like, you're taking my favorite players away from my favorite league and you're bringing them to your league, and that's annoying. You're trying to take Mo Salah away from Liverpool. You're taking Jordan Henderson away. You're taking Neymar away. You're taking Ronaldo away. You're trying to take Messi, etc., etc. That's annoying for the general sports fan. You're ruining the PGA. That's annoying. But then they realized, okay, while we may be vilified in a way over here in combat sports, and in boxing in particular, we're heroes. in combat sports and in boxing in particular, because it was so fragmented, Turki has been hailed a hero because he was able to put together the biggest fights. In the last 2 years, it's been one of the greatest stretches in recent boxing history because he has put together the biggest fights, undisputed title fights. Fury Usyk couldn't figure it out. Now they're figuring it out. Beterbiev Bivol couldn't figure it out. Now they're fighting twice. Again, Ben Eubank, they couldn't figure it out. He's figuring it out, and they're doing it again in November. Like, and on and on and on it goes. And so that's why you've seen them as of late, like, really focus on combat sports, because they aren't disruptors there. They're actually like matchmakers. They're actually the ones being hailed as the ones who are saving these sports. And to your point, like, all you needed were some deep pockets and a vision and a willingness to say, like, hey, all the promoters, all you guys, I don't care about your differences. I don't care about your egos. You want the money? You want the big fights? Come to us. And that's what you've seen has happen. Every single major promoter, including TKO, has come to them and to him in particular, and has done business because of their willingness to pay top dollar to make these big events and big fights possible.
Yeah, you made the Eddie Hearn Matchroom point earlier, it's kind of one of the most striking things we've seen was like himself and Frank Warren, who, as far as I know, weren't on speaking terms in their professional lives, all of a sudden putting on fights together on the
Not
regular.
just fights together,
Yeah,
like
shows together.
singing Kumbaya together, like holding hands and like being the best of friends. Like these guys, the way they would speak of each other, they couldn't even fathom being in the same room. And now, now they're both under the zone umbrella, and they're both the best of friends. By the way, if Turkey left for whatever reason and said, "I'm done with all of this," I would imagine everyone would go back to their respective corners. But for now, everyone's the best of friends.
One aspect of this, I suppose, like if it does go down the UFC model and we game theory that for a second, and that's what boxing becomes, and the best fight the best, I think like the fans will think that's great, and those matchups you mentioned will happen more regularly, and an issue like Mayweather Pacquiao wouldn't happen again, where the two best in division are kept apart for a decade or so. So that's what the fans care about, and I appreciate that. But you've done sterling work over the years about MMA pay versus boxing pay, and Francis Ngannou, a recent example of someone who bet on himself and left MMA and got paid very well in boxing. So I just wonder, like in the context of unions and things like that, and you've talked to George St. Pierre and others about this over the years. In your experience, does that stuff have cut through? Like, do the fans engage with that, the pay disparity, or do they ultimately just want to see the best fight the best?
Yeah, it's more the latter. I mean, there's obviously some fans that appreciate it and are into it, but sometimes they'll tell me to just shut up. And certainly, the power players don't love it. That was, essentially, my biggest issue with the UFC. They viewed it as me being a nuisance or, being some sort of troublemaker. And I'm a big sports fan, and so I see what happens in the NBA or Major League Baseball, the NFL, the numbers and the revenue sharing and the seat at the table that the players have, and I compare it to what's going on in MMA. Forget about MMA versus boxing, because they have always said to us, like, we are a major league sport, the UFC, MMA. It's a major league sport. We're not, we're not competing with other MMA promotions. We're competing with the NFL. We're competing with the top dogs. And so I'm treating them as such, and I'm then comparing them to the NFL and the NBA, and I'm saying, wait a second, in those leagues, those players get 50% of the revenue. What do they get in the UFC? Now it's been reported 12, 18, something like that. All right, well, even if it's 25, it's nowhere near that much. They just signed this gigantic $7+ billion deal with Paramount here in the United States. What percentage of that is going to the fighters? Zero as of now. It's up to them. They can bump it if they want, but there's no collective bargaining agreement. And so yeah, I mean, we could talk about the purses in boxing, but like what about just in general sports? And so there are some top guys who do quite well, and that's been, as Connor really helped change a lot of that by pushing the agenda, and other fighters have benefited from it, but it's nowhere near, especially what they're sacrificing and how they're putting their bodies and minds and health on the line. I don't think it's fair. But there'll be a lot of fans who will say, like, yo man, just stop talking about, like, just talk about the fights. Give me the goods. As I always like to say, that there's a lot of fans who are like, give me my DraftKings, give me my Buffalo Wild Wings, give me my beer, give me my pizza, give me my Saturday night, and like, go talk about that other stuff in the corner. And I get that, because for them, this is their big weekend thing. This is their bonding. This is their camaraderie. This is their Saturday night with their friends. I get that 100%. But it's, for me, it's my job. And so I'll talk about that stuff too. But I feel I have a duty to talk about the other stuff.
One thing maybe fans don't love about the current UFC situation is the single brand identity, like the sameness of entrances and things like that. And that's one thing boxing has, I think, which to our earlier point still taps into that WWE showmanship, pizzazz. Like, I think boxing brings more to the table in that regard. And I feel like if the UFC got their paws on that, they might sanitize it a bit as well.
Yeah, I wonder, although we're seeing some signs that it's not going to be a carbon copy for this particular event, at least. They're doing it in a stadium, like I said. Even little things like there's a thing in boxing on fight week where they like to do this grand arrival. They'll usually do it on a Monday or Tuesday of fight week, and it's the fighters coming to the hotel, and there's a whole big song and dance. UFC doesn't do it. They're doing it for Canelo Crawford. And so maybe they've recognized that some of the things need to stay intact. But yes, I mean, I've talked extensively about the uniforms in the UFC, and that drives me nuts. It drives me, and that's when they justify the uniforms. They say, "Oh, we're just like the NFL, the NBA," but they're not. You know what we are usually drawn to, among many other things, but to me, what's a very important thing about combat sports is the individuality, the uniqueness of these characters, right? Like when I was a kid and I saw Mike Tyson walk to the ring wearing all black with a towel over his head and black boots and black shorts, like I thought that that was the coolest thing in the world. When I saw Chuck Liddell wearing shorts, the Iceman, with like icicles on it, or Tito Ortiz with fire, the Huntington Beach bad boy, that stood out. When George St. Pierre walked out with his gi, that stood out to me. Now they all look the same, and they put them in their venue called the UFC Apex, which is great. I get it. They save a lot of money. It's brilliant. They can own and operate it, but it all feels the same. It all feels like, you know, the McDonaldization of MMA. I'm a huge fan of everything that goes into combat sports. And when I say everything, I mean everything. From the posters to the commercials. I'm a sucker for all this stuff. To the showmanship, right? And I don't like the rinse repeat. So I hope they don't do that, because in boxing as well, the trunks, the walkouts, all that stuff is so much fun. I'm still in awe of what Chris Eubank Jr. and his father did back in April. And if this is the UFC, that doesn't happen. Their walkout that they had at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, the emotion involved, the story that they told just from the walkout, everything needs. You know, Conor had to fight to get Sinead O'Connor to sing him out when he fought. They've never done that again, and they never did that prior. Meaning, like someone making it different. And so I'm not a huge fan of that. They like everything to be uniform. I get it to a degree from their perspective, but I hope they don't do that in boxing.
You touched on the UFC deal, Ariel. It's really seismic. Like, and going back to 2016 and the initial takeover, and just to see the value of the brand at this stage. What's notable, I suppose, in a more in a wider context is, and we've seen this in press releases before, and it hasn't actually come to pass, the death of pay-per-view and that kind of thing. Do you think this could truly be a game changer in terms of that long term in America?
Oh yeah, I mean they've said it, even though it was very clunky, because they initially said this is the death of pay-per-view, and then Dana White said no, pay-per-view's not dead. But I think what he was really trying to say is like, hey, we still have 5 more pay-per-views on
Don't forget to buy
ESPN.
those.
Exactly, because it was literally that week that they had the Khamzat Chimaev Dricus du Plessis show in Chicago, and it was very awkward to say to people, "Hey, pay-per-view is dead." And I'm sure ESPN, their partner who they're leaving, it was like, "Yo, wait a second, we still have 5 more on the books here." But come 2026 so it's 7 years, so that would be to 2033. God willing, we're all still here to witness all of this. They're not going to be doing pay-per-view. It's going to be on Paramount Plus here in America. It's going to be on CBS. Over in the UK and Ireland, I know it's on TNT Sports, and there's maybe one, if there's a European angle like a Tom Aspinall these days, there's maybe one show behind the pay-per-view paywall. But you guys have been experiencing this long before we have, and so once they're out of the pay-per-view game, which I didn't necessarily see coming, I thought that they would still remain maybe 4 a year as opposed to 12, 13 a year as they do now. Once they're gone, WWE's already left pay-per-view long ago. DAZN has already said that they're not going to do that anymore. They haven't really given a timetable for that, but they've said they're going to maybe have like a subscription thing within their subscription thing to get the premium fights. Who knows? I don't think it's going to be a major thing anymore. Like by the time 2033 rolls around, I don't see any other entity doing pay-per-view, because if you're a basketball, baseball, football, hockey fan here in America, the biggest and best aren't behind a paywall. And so it was always very crazy to think that the biggest and best of MMA and boxing was behind this like $79.99 paywall. And that has surely stunted the growth of those sports. The UFC has succeeded, obviously, in spite of it. But this could be huge in terms of getting the sport, both sports, out there in front of more eyeballs and growing it. But I always look at both sides of the coin. if you're a UFC fighter, and in particular a UFC champion, you actually liked being on pay-per-view, even though it meant maybe less people seeing you compete, because if you're a UFC champion, you got something called pay-per-view points, meaning you got to participate in the business of the pay-per-view. That was really like the brass ring. And so how are they going to offset that now if you're a champion who in your contract it states if the pay-per-view sells X amount of, of shows, okay, I'm going to get X amount, this percentage, et cetera, et cetera. How are you going to make that right? They've yet to make that clear. They've yet to explain that. But to me, that was the first thing that came to mind. Great for the fans, amazing. You don't have to spend $1,000 a year on pay-per-view shows. It's very expensive to be a combat sports fan. But I always think about the fighters because ultimately there is no sport without them.
And like quality fights are being made and the matchmaking is good, but I think it's a fair point to make that they got this incredible, unprecedented deal at a time when maybe the star power in terms of names that transcend MMA circles aren't quite on the par of 10 years ago with Conor McGregor, who we've mentioned, the likes of Ronda Rousey and so on. Have they proved to be like cautionary tales where it just ends up people like yourself are always asked, when's Conor coming back? When's Ronda fighting again? That they're actually happy to lean into the UFC is coming to town. Either we're going to buy tickets to go or we're going to watch it regardless.
Well, the biggest star in the UFC is the UFC, those three letters. The second biggest star is Dana White. And that's done on purpose because the UFC isn't leaving and Dana White's not leaving anytime soon. And so yes, they and WWE are the only two, and coincidentally they're both under the TKO umbrella. They're the only two combat sports entities in the world who could say, "Hey, we're coming to town on October 17th, get your tickets now," and not announce a single fight. Eddie Hearn can't do that. Queensberry can't do that. Boxer can't do that. Top Rank can't do that. On and on it goes. No, they've got a big show. Eddie Hearn does on the same day as Canelo Crawford in Belfast, but it's a big show because it's a big rematch involving Paddy Donovan and Lewis Crocker. They don't just go and say Matchroom is coming to town. Get your tickets now. UFC can do that, and they could close to sell out. WWE the same because everyone knows what that brand is. And by the way, that's not a knock. That's a credit to them. The fact that they made that into the biggest draw is unbelievable. And so they don't want to change that anytime soon. And there was a period there where it felt like Conor was about to become bigger than the brand. And I think they gave him a lot of leeway. They did a lot of things for Conor that they didn't do for others. Fight for a second belt, fight Floyd Mayweather, all this stuff and more. They never wanted to do that. Anderson Silva was begging them to fight Roy Jones Jr. back in the day, begging them to let him fight Roy Jones Jr. They always said no, and that would have been a gigantic fight. And so I don't think they'll be so quick to give that up because Conor kind of turned into a beast, right? But I always brush off the lack of stars talk. I mean, it is true right now. There's no one on the level of Conor or Ronda from 10 years ago, but combat sports very cyclical. So it all comes and goes. Like there was a time where the heavyweight division was incredible. And then there was a time in boxing. And then there was a time where the heavyweight division sucked like 15 years ago. And now the heavyweight division is very interesting again. And Joshua and Tyson are leaving, but then you've got guys like Moses Itauma coming up, and it's all very exciting. And so everything is cyclical in combat sports. And maybe a year ago it was like, oh gosh, who's the next big star? But here comes Ilya Topuria, and here comes Khamzat Chimaev, and there's Islam Makhachev moving up to 170, and there's Jack Della and Alex Volkanovski coming back, and on and on and on it goes. So it's fine, but they don't have to worry, in my opinion, as much, because they're not reliant on the stars as much as the others. The star is the brand, the star is the promoter, and people want to be, they want to be a part of that. And so when they come to town once a year, once every 2 years, people are jumping at that, and we're seeing that because the gates are higher than ever and the attendance is fantastic.
And just to round this off with the WWE of it all, like of the trifecta of combat sports we're talking about here, the obvious distinction is there's certainty of outcome, shall we call it, in WWE, and a lot is predetermined, but you wouldn't know that based on the sports deals that are being divvied out. Like they've made, like as they often do, like made a preemptive strike to make that deal with Netflix. Just when people are settling into that, they pivot again and make another extraordinary deal with ESPN and talk from TKO of putting the E back in ESPN and this kind of stuff. And then like you're part of this as well. The sincerity with which WWE is covered now, like Joe Tessitore's on the call, ESPN go there and cover it and like ask real questions if you get me. Like it's covering it in a sincere way. And then you had like, for example, recently Karrion Kross on and having a sports conversation with him in the way you would interview an MMA fighter or a boxer. So as we both did, starting as a WWE/F fan, it must be striking to see how it's being incorporated into that mainstream conversation.
Oh, it's wild. I mean, could you have ever imagined 10 years ago WWE being on ESPN? I worked for ESPN 2018 to 2021. And I remember during that stretch, WrestleMania was at MetLife Stadium in New Jersey, close to where I live, local. And I was like, let's go do something. Let's go cover it. No interest. Sports Center, no interest. Doing interviews there, no interest. And now look at them. It's unbelievable. And by the way, a lot of that has to do with the aforementioned Nick Khan, who has had a huge and long-standing and very positive working relationship with ESPN and a great relationship with the brass over there, Jimmy Pitaro, the president. And so I never saw this coming, this switcheroo. WWE goes on ESPN, UFC goes from ESPN to Paramount. It's wild. And you're seeing WWE being covered on SportsCenter. You're seeing them do this show coming up later this month called WrestlePalooza. And initially we all thought that the deal would start where they would have their 13 PLEs, they call them now, premium live events, because they're no longer on pay-per-view. So it's like their big shows, if you will. We thought that this was going to start in mid 2026 because they had an exclusive deal with Peacock to air those events. Peacock is the streaming platform for NBC. And then all of a sudden we get a press release saying it starts in September and WrestleMania is going to be on ESPN and all this stuff. It's like, wow, who would have thought it? So for a long time pro wrestling fan, it kind of feels like validation. It sort of feels like, oh, wow, like, this is legit. If you get what I'm saying. Obviously, I understand that it's scripted. I could totally see, the hardcore NFL fan being like, "What the hell is this? Why is this being covered like this?" But from my perspective, I don't have to answer to that necessarily. Like when I have the guys on my show, they're the most fascinating characters in the world to me. Like the Karrion Kross thing was, I mean, for me, riveting. Like I couldn't believe I was sitting there listening to this stuff. Paul Heyman. And on it goes. I love doing that, and I think that they're just interesting people. I don't ask them questions like, "Are you going to win tonight?" Because I have respect for what they do. But if you're able to break kayfabe, as they say, break through the character, to me, I don't care if you're an MMA guy, a wrestling guy, a boxer, a kickboxer, a bare knuckle fighter. I find fighters, combat sports athletes, and I include wrestlers, pro wrestlers in that equation. I find them to be the most fascinating people to talk to. They're very open, they're very honest, they're raw, they're rugged, they're thoughtful. I've talked to athletes from other sports. They're nowhere near as interesting as these individuals. They have to sell themselves to the public, and so I enjoy it very much. And I don't care what kind of rule set they're dealing with. To me, it's all kind of the same.
And lastly, before I let you go, just you mentioned Conor McGregor earlier, and as we record today, just some news around him and him trying to, I suppose, formalize a run for president in Ireland, which you probably wouldn't have foreseen when you did that famous and very engaging walk and talk with him a decade or more ago. I think, as you probably will have gleaned in the subsequent years, like he has never had a seamless relationship with the Irish people and has obviously been framed in an altogether more serious light following the verdict in the Nikita Hand trial, for example. So just from your vantage point and US sports and UFC lens, like, is he still a professional athlete to your mind? Like, is that still a viable avenue for him, or is he more likely to end up in our version of the White House than fighting on that White House show?
I know he's very polarizing, and I know that people in Ireland have very strong feelings towards him. But as far as like the way he's viewed in America, I could tell you that if he did come back, it would be a huge deal. It would be covered more so than any other MMA fighter. It would be, if there was pay-per-view, it would do well over 1 million buys. And that's always like kind of like the threshold as to who's a superstar or not. People still ask me about him almost like weekly, daily. He's still a lot of people's favorite fighter, despite everything. He says he's going to fight on the White House card. I know he has a relationship with Donald Trump. I believe he wants to fight on the White House card. Does it actually come to fruition? That remains to be seen. It's still 10 months away. He also is a part owner in BKFC and says he wants to compete in that as well. I don't know how you can pull off running for president and also being an active athlete. The days of him fighting two, three times, four times a year are obviously over, and they have been for quite some time. I do think somewhere, somehow, Conor McGregor will compete in a combat sports event. Where, when, how, what rules, that I don't know. But I don't think we have seen him fight for the last time. That I feel. This is not. I'm not talking to you with insider knowledge, by the way. Like I don't know of any sort of contract for a fight, but I believe that. I don't think he'll go out the way in which his last fight went. The breaking of the leg, the Dustin Poirier scene, all that stuff. So I guess the question is like, does that mean he's an athlete in your opinion? He's obviously not active these days. So remains to be seen if he does fight. I don't think we see him before the White House card, and I don't even know if we see him on the White House card. But I guess that will be very telling if he doesn't end up on that card. Maybe that means his true active days are over. And maybe we don't see him again. But I do think in some way, shape, or form, we'll see him at least once before his time is done.
And I know you're certainly active and busy. Year one done in your new venture with the On Crown platform. Are you enjoying it?
Yeah, man, I love it, and I'm a huge fan of journalism, and I'm a huge believer in journalism, and I'm a huge believer in trying to cover things the right way and combat sports journalism, and to be able to have this opportunity to, kind of be my own boss and not just that, bring my colleagues and friends along with me and hopefully create something that will have a lasting legacy. I joke that we're the number one unbiased combat sports platform on the planet. I say that a little bit tongue in cheek because the lines are being very much blurred these days. But I do feel that and mean that, and I'm very, very proud of the work that all these people have done and have come together to put on. So, I mean, like the stuff on the website, as far as writing is concerned, it blows me away. The coverage, how thoughtful it is, how thorough it is, how well researched it is. I think we have some of the best writers in sports, period, not just combat sports, contributing to the site. And then, the videos and the pods and all that stuff that we're doing as well. It's a dream come true. This is all I ever wanted to do. And I feel very grateful and very thankful that in my early 40s that I'm able to do this. And I hope it, as you would say, I guess, long may it continue. I hope it never ends.
Ariel Helwani, thanks very much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.